on your workplace. We've examined returning non-critical workers or critical workers to work, and then we had a Q&A. But now that your budgeting season has ramped up, now that we have more data and information on the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy and your budgets, today we're going to discuss public sector labor negotiations and workforce cost cutting in a COVID-19 economy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chelsea.
Thanks, Brandon. Good morning, everyone. So just a quick run through of our topics that we're going to be covering today during the webinar. So of course, as Brandon mentioned, the main topic is public sector labor negotiations and cost-cutting measures. But before we get to those specific topics, we're going to run through a few quick updates, and then from there, touch quick on the survey that was sent out from CGMC, and hopefully everyone's received that survey at least once, if not more times at this point. And then I'll turn it over to Brandon to give us a foundation on labor contracts and personnel policies. And related to that, since we're going to be running through specific provisions, so you can see those provisions below: wages, specialty or premium pay, fringe benefits, furlough and reduction of hours, subcontracting and hiring freeze, and layoff and voluntary separation incentives. So after going through all of those provision and cost-cutting related measures, we'll go into process. So just generally, what is the process related to those items, and then hopefully have some time at the end there to answer some questions. As always, if you do have any questions, we ask that you please submit those through the chat function, as opposed to the Q&A function. And as we receive those, we do see them, so we'll try to incorporate those into the presentation, and then follow up if needed on any questions that we might have missed or haven't been able to address. So for a Minnesota-specific update, at the end of last week, Governor Walz signed Executive Order 2074, which is effective today, end of day, so effectively tomorrow. And that's really just branching off of the last executive order as we're continuing to open sectors of the economy. And so a lot of those provisions that were included in the newest executive order aren't new. For example, it still states continue to work from home whenever possible. Any worker who can work from home must do so. It still includes that safe work protections that were addressed in more detail in Executive Order 2054 remain in full force and effect, meaning that all work has to be conducted in a manner that adheres to Minnesota OSHA standards, along with guidelines from the Minnesota Department of Health and the CDC. And then one item that I do want to highlight, although this first piece isn't new, we brought this up in a previous webinar, that non-critical businesses choosing to open or remain open had to establish and implement a COVID-19 preparedness plan, which there are other requirements related to that, and a previous executive order went into detail what that plan is required to entail, but that plan has to be provided in writing to all workers, be posted at all locations, and where it's not possible to physically post or not practicable, employers can also, or in lieu of, post that electronically. So when we discussed that, at the time, we mentioned that our take was that that COVID-19 preparedness plan was something that cities would be required to implement as well. And even if not required by the executive order, it would be a best practice to implement that. So at that time, we put through a template plan customized for public entities, which we had on the CGMC website. And we discussed how employer, depending on the entity, that there should be more specific supplementary measures put in place related to specific employee groups and different facilities, which obviously will depend on the entity. But what is an update related to that is that beginning June 29th of 2020, all critical businesses, so including cities, must have developed and implemented a COVID-19 preparedness plan. So that is something that cities, if you haven't, or counties or whatever the entity, if you haven't already implemented a COVID-19 preparedness plan, that is something that is required beginning June 29th. In addition, this is probably the biggest update related to this executive order, but the number of places of public accommodation, so indoor, outdoor pools, gymnasiums, recreation centers, a lot of other venues supporting events are opening up to the public starting Wednesday, albeit with certain limitations on capacity, and the executive order goes into more detail on that, and industry guidance specific to all of those, I mean, pools, gymnasiums, anything goes into more detail on the Stay Safe Minnesota website, and we have that website address there as well in case you'd like to look at that further. Also, not new from this executive order, but still the executive order states that remote meetings are strongly encouraged whenever possible. Masks and face coverings are strongly encouraged, and at-risk persons are strongly urged to stay home or in their place of residence and follow the provisions of Executive Order 2055. So just a visual, this is the safely adjusting the dials metaphor that's been used for the past several weeks now, but just showing that the settings have been adjusted accordingly with this most recent executive order going into effect tomorrow. Quick update on state budget. So if you joined us for the last webinar, again, a lot of this information isn't new, but it does set the scene for our discussion throughout this webinar. So MMB, which typically releases its full-fledged economic outlook in November and February of each year, they release an updated budget projection for the current biennium, because the February budget outlook that was released at the end of February, I believe, it didn't take into account really at all COVID-19 related impacts on the economy. So with that budget update, as expected, the state budget and economic outlook had significantly worsened. And throughout that budget update, it was noted that the outlook would likely continue to remain volatile for some time because the path of the COVID-19 pandemic is relatively unknown, uncertain, and as is consumers, businesses, and government's responses to the pandemic. A few quick details on budget. So there is a $2.426 billion budget deficit projected for the current biennium, and so that is a change of about $4 billion, from the February 2020 forecast. And with that, total general fund revenues are expected to be over 3.6 or 7.4% billion less than the February forecast, with spending expected to be around $391 million higher. So the budget, although typically that forecast does go into the next biennium and beyond because of the current pandemic, and that, again, the uncertainty related to the pandemic, the budget stated that it wasn't possible to accurately project state revenue and spending into the next biennium, and so it didn't provide figures related to that. But the thought is that the next biennium will still continue to show a negative impact on the state budget. Okay, if you did receive the CGMC in brief, this is not new information, but it is expected that a special session with a particularly long agenda will be beginning on June 12th, Friday of this week. And that is because Governor Walz must convene the legislature in order to extend his emergency powers related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the long list of agenda items, that includes both a bonding bill and also resolution of the Federal CARES Act money, which important update is that the U.S. Treasury Department updated its guidance on local government distribution of CARES Act money. So what that did was it changed the way that funding is calculated, as it was to be going to local governments, and it would allocate 45% or $841 million of Minnesota's total CARES Act funding to local government. So previously, based on the previous guidance, the amount of funding for local government distribution was calculated to be around $667 million. So this is obviously, with this change, an increase in around $200 million. So that is significant. With labor contract settlements, so interestingly, last year, Governor Walz's administration and the labor unions that represent state employees did negotiate agreements that were set to provide most state employees with a 2.25% raise in July of 2019, and then also a 2.5% raise in July of 2020. Based on process, the state legislature does still need to vote to approve the contracts, but it adjourned on Monday, May 18th, 2020, without approving those contracts formally. So while the Minnesota House of Representatives voted to approve the contracts, including the pay raise that was due for July, the Senate passed legislation postponing the raises until July of 2021. Which was in response to the current economic crisis and how to handle that related to what was expected to be a significant projected surplus that obviously didn't come to fruition. But the result of that, so the MMB commissioner stated that they had conducted a legal review at MMB, and what was stated is that although state law requires legislators approve those labor contracts, it doesn't give legislators authority to unilaterally modify the agreements or plans. So by voting to approve the contracts with those raises, the Senate effectively did approve them. So that is the latest update that we have on the labor contract settlements. And that's how it stands at this time, is that the 2.5% raise for state employees represented under those labor agreements would go into effect this July. Okay, and for a quick federal update, so with the second economic stimulus bill, which is a question mark because we don't know if and when that will happen, senators are likely not to vote on a second economic stimulus bill until at least July. And with that new stimulus bill, the thought is that the unemployment rate will possibly have some influence on what is in that next stimulus bill. So there's going to be at least one more jobs report that is released before the Senate is likely to vote on a second stimulus bill. And if the jobs report shows that the unemployment rate has improved, again, because it did improve slightly with the May jobs report, that there will be less of a sense of urgency. And even if there is a second economic stimulus bill, likely have an impact on what is included in that. So potential items are listed here, but there's been discussion of extension of some unemployment benefits, COVID-19 liability protection, aid to states and local governments, payroll tax cut, which President Trump has expressed a lot of desire to have that be part of a second economic stimulus bill if there is one, potential return to work cash bonus, tax deductions, but a second stimulus check at this point seems pretty uncertain, and hazard pay and more employee leaves are also thought to be unlikely at this point. So with federal wage increases, so in December,
Hello, everybody. We had an audio glitch, so we'll hopefully back on. If you can hear me, we'll let Chelsea jump back on. But bottom line with the economic update, the National Bureau of Economic Research, of course, not surprisingly, has stated that we are now in a recession, which was effective February 2020. But in what that did, interestingly, with this COVID-19, the severity and quickness of the impact, it brought an end to what was a record-long expansion of the economy, which lasted over 10 years. So again, not a surprise there. Again, back to what we'd stated in a previous seminar or webinar, MMB, Minnesota Management and Budget, their consultant that they rely on to make budget projections, just to be cognizant, did project a 5.4% decline, but then they project that the economy will rebound back in 2021. And then, so what has been happening in the job situation? As of June 5th, for the May data, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics stated that the unemployment rate did decline by 1.4 percentage points to what is still an abysmal number of 13.3%, yet 2.5 million jobs were gained in May of 2020. Now, of course, again, if you're a politician, you get one argument for you, one against you, depending on what side you're on. So what does that data mean? So on one hand, it means we had the biggest 1 month job gain in US recorded history. Now, of course, overall employment's down, but it was the biggest uptick of 2.5 million jobs increasing from 1 month to the next. And obviously, why was that? Like a lot of used local governments, you began reopening and you're rehiring laid off workers. But as I indicated earlier, what are the two large asterisks to that? One, we have 19.6 million fewer employed than last year at this time, so roughly 20 million less employees overall. And then DOL made a conspicuous, as they stated, error, which indicates the actual unemployment rate would actually be much higher. And of course, the real telling number of how troubling things are, over 30 million people in the US have applied for unemployment benefits. Then we get to what's happening on the local government level. Per Moody's, who's a reputable economic resource, they stated that obviously US local government outlook is changing to negative from what their classification was stable. They expect the duration and intensity of the coronavirus, COVID-19, to grow in severity as we move along, and we've seen that. And they also emphasize for local governments, obviously a lot of you who are primarily reliant on property tax revenue, there's always a lag. So when the economy goes up, you lag when your budgets go up. When the economy goes down, your budgets lag in going down just based on the nature of how property tax revenue works. But what they do predict, of course, is that sales and income tax revenue is going to decline sharply. And obviously the primary impetus for that is the expanded unemployment. And also related to that, what we see in the future is that, with the PRA, or for those who have local pensions, that it's going to be much more difficult for you to afford that. And all of you, of course, with PRA have mandatory contributions. So you've seen the uptick in that, and that might just continue. So on the next slide, what's happening on the federal, state, and local government level is we've shed over 1.5 million jobs since March nationwide. And the number of government employees, number of bodies working for all of you as governments, is the lowest now it's been since 2001. So we're even lower for number of employees than we were during the Great Recession. And again, these are much more centralized on the local level, especially when a lot of your facilities at that level were simply shut down. So you had nothing for a lot of those workers to do. And then, several states, and some of you can see this who are reliant on income and sales tax, sales tax revenue, are projecting that their revenue is going to be down 20% or more just this fiscal year. So then on the next slide, we see that job losses in April were larger than all of the cuts in the Great Recession. So in 1 month, you shed more jobs than you all did during the Great Recession. So it was close to 1 million jobs. Now, again, as we talked about, some of your reopening and per the governor's orders, we're rebounding a little bit. But, one thing, again, more so from a think tank, but one that puts out reputable information, if we look back at the Great Recession, the sole pace of the economic recovery was, again, a circuitous argument attributable in part to the fact that public spending was cut. Well, your spending was cut because revenue was down. And then what they try to emphasize is the more you're spending, for example, on employees, more than half of the result in economic activity or growth trickles down into the private sector. So again, we'll see a lot of those interesting policy debates, but that's how it's impacting you now. So then on the next slide, all right, we'll improvise here with a little bit of a technology problem. So now we're going to have a question for participants. And that is, what is your unit of government's projected revenue decline in calendar year 2020? So a screen will pop up. Is it 0% or an increase? 0.01% to 5%, 5% to 10%, or 10% plus. So we'll do that quick poll and see where you all are at. Again, projected revenue decline in calendar year 2020. So where are you at? Interestingly, so what we do see is one is an overwhelming majority. You obviously will see a projected revenue decline just in this calendar year, but the plurality of you, though it's close, are going to see a 5 to 10% decline in your projected revenue. So you all see why we had to, as units of government, had to move quickly with the personnel actions we took. Now this seminar is really going to focus on, all right, what is this going to mean going forward, not only for this year, but looking for 2021 onwards. So on the next slide, what's the quick update? Again, when we look at this, we are reliant on so one, where's the data today? As of June 8th, Minnesota had over 28,000 cases. And the number of tests that were completed, again, more testing leads to more diagnoses, exceeded 10,000 for the 5th day. But yet the numbers of people hospitalized in ICUs continue to fall. And again, the governor obviously is part of what's happening and modeling, relied on that substantially, why there's more of a reopening, especially for larger facilities with larger gatherings in the economy. But they do also continue to state that, look at, the number is likely going to be higher or it could be lower just because there's obviously difficulty in reporting and reporting delays. So what's happening nationwide, about 2 million cases with over 110,000 deaths. But CDC is now projecting that the number of newly reported deaths per week attributable to COVID-19 will continue to decline. But then, of course, we have the asterisk, as we talked about last time. Next slide. Per the University of Minnesota study, is that there may be a somewhat of a decline here in the summer or a peak happening soon, but the concern is there could be a tsunami of communicable diseases. One, COVID may peak back up, and two, on top of that, seasonal flu will, again, of course, as hardy Minnesotans, we're used to it. We're going to see an uptick in that in the fall. So that is a concern. Now, there's a bunch of different scenarios that the U is laid out on the next slides. But that's something we all should be cognizant of, that there may be a little bit of a status quo, a little bit of a calm in the summer, but there could be an uptick in the fall, which is not only going to impact what's going to happen through facilities and the governor's order, but clearly that's going to have an impact on the economy. So now with that, if we can get to the next slides, we're going to talk about, as Chelsea indicated early, we put out a survey to ask two primary things of all of you. One is, what are you doing on the labor negotiations front? And two is, what are you doing for other cost-cutting measures? So we'll just have a 1-minute delay here, hopefully, as we get through the next slides. All right, so first thing we'll talk about is what are all of you doing for settlements? So as we'll keep going through the next slides here. And I again apologize for the technology delay. All right, so and again, I apologize, we're getting through here. All right, there we go. So we will get to the settlement slide. All right, so first, let me step back. Let's talk about, what's the foundation before we all start negotiating and implementing cost-cutting measures. So first we need to do an audit of our labor contracts and personnel policies. And I'm sorry, we'll get to the next slide here. All right, so we're going to give some examples of language in your contracts, but for those who are non-union, even your personnel policies. So why are we doing that? First, it's one, to determine what changes can you just implement unilaterally. Though we're going to recommend discussions with unions, what things can you do even if the union objects or even if they're in your personnel policies. So on one hand, there are two changes generally we can look at making, obviously with some legal uncertainty and risk. So first is during the effective dates of your contract, and what you do need to think about is you all enter, negotiations are likely going to start late for those who haven't settled for 2021. So if your contracts expire on 12/31/20, we have to be cognizant that under Minnesota's public labor law, your contract will continue in effect after 12/31/20 if you have no deal. So we need to be careful with that. And we'll try to get to the next slide here. All right. And also, what is rare in Minnesota, we hear a lot about, you could put a whole seminar on it, but that is, well, what happens if we reach an impasse in negotiations? We're in 2021, our contract expires in 20. Can we just do what we want if the union doesn't agree? Now, that's untested, unproven waters for employers in Minnesota's public sector. There's a body of law in the private sector, but it's excruciatingly difficult. So there is a body of law that says we could do it, but rarely is it effective. So that's why we're focused on contract language, because if you have, however, good contract language, maybe there are things you can do. So on the second part, even if you don't implement while a contract's in effect, we have to look at, all right, are there changes in the contract we need to negotiate and change, and what should we look at doing in our contracts? So first we have to recognize, especially when you all economically can't put as much on the table for compensation, it's tougher to get a quid pro quo with language. So we need to be cognizant of that. In addition, for those who have essential units like public safety or supervisors that you're negotiating with, the general arbitral standard is you need a compelling reason to make a change. Now, sometimes it's enough to say every other, for example, bargaining unit in our employer has it, but often even that may not be enough. So we need to be cognizant of that. Now, the part of the risk is, though we're going to advise maybe looking at changing your contracts, it's the double-edged sword. On one hand, that sounds good. On the other hand, if the union rejects it and you never reach agreement or get an arbitrator to agree with language you propose to change, there is a body of law that says, by the way, for example, if you propose language that says we as management have the right to schedule, let's say that's not in your contract and the union rejects it and we execute a contract without it, there can be an argument from the union because you proposed it, that means we needed your right to schedule in the contract, but now because that's not in the contract, you waived your management right to do it unilaterally. So as you can tell, you got to be very cautious. On one hand, it's good to propose language changes. On the other hand, we need to have conditional language and be careful about proposing language. So in addition to language, we're obviously all focused on wages and fringe benefits. We're trying to negotiate, get agreement from the unions. So you're all focused on the budgets, but what we need to be cognizant when we're negotiating with the unions, we always have to look at, in the end game, if we can't reach a deal here, how would an arbitrator for an essential unit look at it? And during times of or difficult economic and financial times, arbitrators sort of reprioritize what they do. First, they look at, well, what have you done for everybody else? So that's going to have the most precedential value for essential bargaining units. In addition, then, unlike the more positive economic times we've had, your ability to pay is going to mean a lot more. So we say this not only to help guide you on what you should propose, but you should also utilize these and package your talking points for negotiations in this order when you're trying to convince the unions to get on board with your wage and fringe benefit package. Third thing, of course, is, though it's now less of a priority than during positive economic times, is if you are proposing something, especially on wages, what does that do relative to your market? Are you moving up? Are you moving down? Or are you staying the same? In some, arbitrators will generally lean on whatever you put out there, they're going to try to keep you relative to the market, your same standing. But again, that's now a third priority, unlike a first or second during positive economic times. You, of course, want to talk about economic conditions that arbitrators weigh, talk about pay equity issues. This happens a lot, for example, with law enforcement units, which are generally what's called male-dominated classes. So we always have to be cognizant if we give them a greater increase than others to help recruit, retain, especially with what's going on beyond the economy with law enforcement. We always have to be careful with that. There's also recruitment retention issues you should raise and workload. Now, on the next slide is, another thing of why we're going through language. These are options for you to consider. So all of you may be thinking, let's reduce hours or let's freeze wages, but if we can't get there, what are other things we should look at? So what are we going to do with language examples? We're going to talk about the good, the bad, and of course, tied to the bad are what are ugly provisions, especially with how arbitrators view them. And we say bad or ugly, really what we mean in this context is that's going to make it very difficult for you as employers to make changes you want unless and until you get union agreement. The good language is language that is going to well position you, especially when it comes to reducing hours, which is a hot topic now, was a hot topic during the Great Recession. So a lot of the language examples we are giving arise directly, of course, from labor contract grievance awards primarily and some interest arbitration awards. And of course, BMS publishes all of Minnesota's public sector awards. So what's the general principle we talk about with language? So first, the principle generally is less is better. So the shorter your contract is in words and pages, generally, especially as a labor lawyer, the better off you are. But in order to fill the gaps of what's not addressed in the contract, on top of that being less is better, we want to make sure that your personnel policies and your compensation and benefit documents that describe those are now updated. Now is a very good time, especially during the summer lull, where you're waiting to see where the budget and finances and COVID goes before you enter negotiations, to get those updated. Because one, they're a good gap filler for things that aren't addressed in contract. And two is, if you adopt them now, even if you can't implement them yet with the unions, it better positions you to get their agreement because you put in writing, here is your wish list. Now, I know a lot of you give the UG when we start talking personnel policy changes, but we have to tell you, we think now is a very good time to well position you to make changes you're going to need to make in a COVID-19, not only economy and budget, but just the way our workplaces have morphed and transformed with flexible scheduling and telework are probably not just going to be short-term fixes, but long-term. So let's get good policies in places. In addition, you should do your audit, talk with payroll. Hey, are we overpaying on holidays? Are we overcounting hours worked for overtime? Now is the good time for you as administrators and managers and HR directors and coordinators to look at those costly past practices like that, and let's work on a strategy and how to end them. In addition, in a contract, which is good, generally, not only should you breathe a sigh of relief if you have it, if you don't have it, you may want to shoot for that. So generally what's good in your employer authority clauses and contracts, which by the way should also be in your personnel policies, one is to itemize all these subjects we're talking about as management rights for you to change hours, to assign work, to subcontract. Secondly, you should have a provision that says, which is a key one arbitrators rely on, that basically if there's a term of employment not addressed in a contract on the second sub-bullet, it's your right as management to change it. So from a labor legal end of things, that's a golden contract. In addition, especially with COVID, a lot of you have the force majeure clauses. So that's just a fancy term for saying, do you have language in your contract when there's unanticipated, uncontrollable circumstances, usually called emergencies in contracts? Do you give yourself the right to simply, consistent with state law, like what the governor has entrenched in law, that if there's a case of emergency, we have rights to take actions, even if they may be inconsistent with contract. The third principle is, or clause to have, is a zipper clause, which says, look at everything we agreed to in the contract are all the items we've agreed to. There's no side agreements. Practices generally mean nothing, even though legally they probably will. So that's called the zipper clause. The third type of clause you want to have is a waiver clause, which basically says, look at, because we've agreed to everything in our contract, anything not in the contract, the parties have waived their right, including the union, to meet and negotiate over it. Now, generally, what's bad, again, contrary to less is better, more is worse. So as a general proposition, the more words you have, the worse it is. And even arbitrators indicate that in these grievance arbitration awards when you're trying to make the changes we're going to talk about. In addition, a lot of you phase this out, but some of you still have the spillover that says, look at, if something's not in the contract, contrary to a good provision, says you have to meet and negotiate over those. Those are horrible provisions, not just bad. So again, good luck in trying to change them now when you don't have much to put economically, but if you do have it, that can raise a lot of issues. And what also generally is bad, which we're not going to try to repeat too much, when it comes to wages and benefits, as a general proposition, it's better to specify years and dates that your wages are in effect, or years and dates that your employer contribution to health insurance is in effect, because then you have an argument, even if your contract spills over while you're negotiating it, the certain provisions might not apply if you had very good language that says, for example, in calendar year 2020 only, our contribution to health insurance is X. Therefore, you have a solid argument if you're still negotiating in 2021 over the 2021 contract that maybe you don't have to contribute what your contract says. Now, again, there's a lot of legal nuances to it, but the more date specific you are, the better when it comes to economic items. So based on that, before we get into all the options you have and specific language to look at, our next poll is this: do you intend to propose substantive contract language in your contracts for 2021? A simple yes or no. So survey says soon. All right, results are in. Not surprising, despite all this, that roughly a third of you are going to propose it, but a substantial majority, 2/3, intend to propose nothing. Again, we get it. It's a lot of work. You need a compelling reason. You have nothing to give economically. So that's probably the reality. About 2/3 of you saying no, but we're trying to give you things to think about, at least in implementing within the confines of your current language, even if you're not going to go for substantive changes. So now we'll move on to more of the specifics. And as I was starting before, what are all you doing with wages? So first we talk about wage changes, generally known as settlements, but specifically what are we talking about? Not steps or movement within ranges. The first thing we're going to focus on is what are all you doing as units of government on general across the board wage increases, primarily to your wage structures. For example, you're giving a 1, a 2, a 3, or you're freezing. So based on our, again, these are more preliminary results, but I think it could be a bellwether. So first set of data, which now may not mean too much, but again, when we start talking about the marketplace, it may mean something. So before the COVID-19 impacts were set in place, where were all of you on wages for 2020 through 2022? So if you look at that third column, which is a combined Greater Minnesota and Twin Cities metro area statewide, what were the average wage changes you were all looking at before COVID hit or had actually settled for? As you can see, you're all roughly in the average 3% range for 20 and 21, a slight downtick of 2.8. But again, anecdotally, based on stats we have, and based on survey, that's where you all were pre-COVID world. Now what's happening in a post-COVID world, and that's our survey. So going left to right, what are these columns? So if you settled before March 1, 2020, what were the averages? And then we get to the next two columns are if you settled after March 1, or what do you intend to do for 2021, where are you at? So what's the average of all these? With who's ever settled or intend to provide, mushing those all together, as you can tell, in a post-COVID world, the average settlements we're going to be looking at or have happened is going to go from the 3 range already down to the 2.1 range for 21. So our last column is before and post March 1st, which is what is the difference in what you're all putting out there or intend to put out for settlements. So we've seen, again, just based on our survey results, a 0.5% decline in what all you're going to look at compared to who locked in pre-March 1 and who's looking at things post-March 1. But then in totality, again, what we think is going to be relevant for all of you in looking at your market, we may look at wage increases in the 2% range, not the 3 like we had. So all of you have to be cognizant of that. You may not like that number, but as we talked about, when it comes to unions, when it comes to interest arbitrators, they're really going to focus on the external average. But again, that's going to be given less weight with the finances and the economy. Now what's happening in 2022? we ought to start to see a slight decline in where settlements are going. So if we look at folks, especially what they intend to provide in 2022, the average is now down to, again, these are all averages based on survey respondents, of 1.38%. But overall, the average that you're all looking at, again, combining everybody who already settled before March 1 and what happened after March 1, you're in the 1.9% range. So for 2022, of course, we're already seeing a decline in what the likely settlements are going to be looking like for units of government in 2022. Then we get to 2023. We have no data on anybody who's locked in any contracts. Again, a quick footnote, PELRA allows for contracts of 1 to 3 years. So obviously, unless you've settled now for 21 through 23, that's why we don't have data. But what are you looking at for those who are looking at it? Now we're starting to plummet average wage increases going down to 1.2%. Again, a lot of this is preliminary. A lot of it's contingent on the update we gave on finances and economy, but I think it could be telling of where wage increases are going to go. So beyond looking at wage changes, another option you can look at is what's called a soft freeze. That is for 2020, which we understand is rare, freeze not applying any general across the board wage increase, but a soft freeze means you may on top of this still be allowing movement in ranges. For most of you in the public sector, it's step increases. So this just focuses on the soft freeze. Again, very few of you have done that for 2020. Tough to do because you've locked in. But as you can see, we start to see a slight uptick, though not overwhelming. Again, the data we gave you supports this, that not a lot of you yet are looking at a 0% or a wage structure freeze for 2021. Now, we do expect that number to uptick for all of you as the potentially budgets get worse. But as you can see, we've got less than 20% of you looking at even a wage structure freeze for 21. So then the second option is more the hard freeze, again, which is rare and was difficult to get upheld during the Great Recession, either through negotiations or in the world of grievance arbitrators or interest arbitrators. So for 2020, we've got no data on anybody not allowing wage movement, also steps for most of you. But in 2021, we see still less of you doing this hard freeze compared to the soft freeze. But again, we see some, again, in the 10% range, a substantial minority looking at step wage freeze movements. Again, that's where you can get a lot of cost savings potentially, but difficult to do. So a lot of you are still looking at more the what are we doing with across the board to mitigate costs, not necessarily freezing movement, but it's something you all can explore. The third option is, which was just rarely ever utilized, but a lot of you are doing it on an annualized basis through reduction in hours, what we'll talk about. That is, though, who on their face is taking this third option of, let's just reduce base wages or salaries on an annual basis for folks. We've got no data for anybody doing it in 20. Very few of you of the three options, this is the less utilized in 2021 are reducing wages. But if you look at the private sector, if you look at, for example, the Society for Human Resource Management, there is some discussion, though it's a policy decision and fairness and philosophy discussion. Some private employers are saying, well, if we want to keep all of you employed, the way to do that is either furloughs or related to that, let's reduce wages. So we are seeing more of that in the private sector, though we don't practice in that area. But if you look at, reputable sources, so again, whether or not it's something quote unquote underutilized in the public sector, again, that's a policy and budget decision. But we're talking with employers, well, if we want to salvage jobs and not go to the layoffs like has happened, for a lot of you as bigger cities and counties, maybe this is a route to go. But we do recognize, yes, it probably is the most difficult thing to get unions agreed to, and good luck, ever getting that approved in interest arbitration. And unfortunately, in the union world, sometimes furloughs and especially layoffs can be easier, but something you all should look at as a third option. Another option is, you can allow for movement given across the board, but just simply prohibit, and a lot of you are going to do this, though we didn't survey it. If you have performance or merit pay, you're just saying that's not going to be happening in a COVID world. We'll still allow for across the board, will still allow potentially for other movement, but not performance or merit pays. So that's option 4. So what's good language that you should either look for, or if you have it, you're in good shape to unilaterally implement, though it's rare. So first, a lot of you we represented on this seminar have language that simply says, which is golden, we are just going to provide you base pay on whatever our structure says. Then in the contract, you don't expressly reference the amounts or the step increases. So that's golden language, and that's good language to give you an argument to freeze wages through a soft freeze, but it is still difficult to get an arbitrator to uphold, for example, in 2021, if you have that language and you say, we're not going to provide steps, it's going to better position you to potentially freeze steps or movement, though it's not impenetrable. So, but again, bottom line, this is golden language, albeit rare. On the other hand, the less you have specified on how base pay is for union employees, again, the better off you are. Still golden that have language that just says they get paid whatever our schedule says or what everybody else has. But if you have some reference to base pay, try to limit the specifics, either amounts, the percentage increase, the step values. Again, less is better. A third option for language, even if you have specifics on your base pay, do what you can to have very specific calendar year or date language. For example, in calendar year 2021 only, from January 1st through December 31st, 2021 only, here's what base pay will be, here's what steps will be. And for those of you who obviously we've done class comp studies for, this is always in our proposed language and base pay structures. Another good one to have, though obviously tough to get in a contract, is specify at least in your base pay schedules that there will be no movement. For example, no step increases will be awarded in the 2021 structure after calendar year 2021. Now, I know a lot of you, it seems obvious, but in the labor world, without that express language, unions have a viable argument that, which happened with grievance arbitration awards, arbitrators consistently said, even with an old, for example, 2020 base pay schedule in the contract with steps, those steps have to still be given in 21 while you're negotiating, unless we have the language that we're talking about. So even if you're not proposing substantive language changes, we still think this is one that's worth a look at to give you more flexibility to potentially make changes as you wish with steps or your schedules. What's bad language? Of course, contrary to the good. The more you specify pay amounts, the more you specify steps and how folks move up on them and when and what percent increases you're giving, the worse. Now, again, a lot of you in the end, we've got to agree to some of this, but try to limit specifics on your pay and contracts. Or if you don't have specific timeframes, that's also not good. So then we get to specialty or premium pay. That's, for example, if you work holidays, if you work overtime, if you work nights, etc. So some of you are already exploring that for 2020, more than going at the base pay. And a lot of you are looking at this more so because you have management right. When we say reduce opportunities, that doesn't mean in your contracts necessarily try to reduce the amount, but you as administrators and managers, especially with your police chiefs and sheriffs of the world, you can take administrative operational measures to do what you can to limit the amount of overtime that you have. Now, that has been difficult when you have a lot more folks on leave in the COVID world, but there are other things you can do with scheduling and operations and man or women power for staffing to reduce those opportunities. A little more of you in 21 are looking at that. So again, put aside contracts and policies and pay, work very closely with your department, your agency, your office heads on ways on, all right, administratively, what can we do without subjecting it to negotiations or reducing what the actual pay is in the contract to reduce how much we're paying for overtime. So what's good contract language? Again, that you've got employer authority to schedule as you wish and assign working hours with you wish. But as I said, this is one, work closely with your supervisors and managers so we can administer this to help mitigate costs. Bad contract language, for example, a lot of you have language that says if there's an emergency or if there's overtime opportunities, a bargaining unit employee has to work that. So for example, we can't have a department head or supervisor, quote unquote, get in the truck to do public works work. So that's language we don't like, something you need to be cognizant of. So what are third options to look at? We got wages, specialty pay. Now let's talk about fringe benefits. Of course, the biggest cost driver for you on all of this, second to base pay, wages, and number one in fringe benefits, is are any of you looking at reducing your health benefit levels? We've only got 3% of you, so still a substantial majority of you are not looking at this as an option. Again, some of you even did this during positive economic times, but it's always an option that's there. Beyond looking at benefit levels, some of you are looking at, though still rare, should we reduce the amount we're paying? For example, the core for most of you is paying the premiums, and a lot of you contribute to health savings accounts or the like. So are we reducing contributions to that? Still in 21, a lot of you are probably looking at freezing that, but we're not seeing a lot of you proposing to reduce that. And a lot of you are looking at more at the wages, because we all know to get a deal at the table, it's better to freeze that amount or increase it, because doing so has a inconsequential impact on taxes and other costs, because it's not subject to taxes, these contributions. It's not subject to PRA. So on one hand, it's a lot more of a flat dollar amount based. So it mitigates the cost more than if you gave a wage increase, which has all those roll-up costs or consequential costs. So that can be telling why a lot of you are not looking to reduce that. But if we look at non-health insurance fringe benefits, like your life insurance, disability insurance, what are you doing with that? Dental insurance, et cetera. Still, we're not looking at a lot of you reducing that for 20 or 2021, but still an option. A third fringe benefit beyond health, other group insurance, is looking at education, training, and other development. This is where we see, again, still a minority of you, but a lot more of you are saying, look at education, training, and other development's good, but especially in 21, we've got to look at a way to mitigate those costs. Because if we're going to still provide wage increases, if we're still going to maintain health insurance, we have to cut cost elsewhere. And again, this is one generally where you can reduce opportunities, not necessarily payments in your contracts. So again, much like reducing specialty or premium pay, this is something working with your managers, administrators, you can look at to reduce costs. Now, what's good language for benefits? Again, a Me Too clause is golden. That basically says in calendar year specifically, you as a union employee in the contract, you will simply get the same health insurance, same contribution as non-union employees or all other employees in the city. So that generally is the more golden language. If you can't get that, it's best to go for flat dollar amount contributions, not percentage based on premiums. Because as we all know, if you have percentage based, even if you have decent calendar language, you're still exposed and setting the precedence. For example, if you say, we'll contribute 80% of the family contribution for health insurance to everybody. Well, that just means automatically, basically, even if not automatic, but precedential wise, you're on the hook if health insurance goes up, which it still could, even in a COVID world. So again, percentage-based are not preferred. And then another language is we don't want generally benefit levels specified in the contract, consistent with our less is better. But even if you do or don't have benefit levels specified, as we'll talk about, there is, on the next slide, Minnesota statute provides that is a public employer, if you reduce, quote, the aggregate value of benefits in your group health insurance plan, you need agreement with the union to do that, regardless of any contract language. However, though rarely successful, we do recommend you may want to consider getting language where the union affirmatively says they waive their right under that law to consent or agree to any benefit change, even if reduced. Again, rarely we ever successful at getting that, but something for you to consider. As we talked about, One, let's not detail benefit levels in the contract. Two, you still need to negotiate changes in benefits. So clearly don't have contract language that says you do. And three is let's avoid percentage-based contributions. Now, the fourth thing in the hopper to look at that we're obviously seeing much more of a high prevalence of is on furloughs and reduction in hours. Now, we think words are crucial here. Generally, if you use the word furlough, that gets the union's legal guard up, that gets the employee guard up. But let's be technical. What is that compared to reduction in hours? A furlough is we're temporarily going to put you on an unpaid leave of absence, whether it's 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. So it's a little more continuity. So unless your contract gives you express right to furlough, which is rare, we prefer where you have arguably the management right, and words are important, that you can reduce the amount of hours. Now, obviously that impacts pay, but what do we mean by that? The bottom line is you are going to schedule employees less in their normal workday, 8 to 7 hours, work week, 40 to 35, work cycle for officers, we're going to shave off a day or shave off hours, or within the entire year. We're going to reduce generally your 2,080 hours for regular 40-hour week employees, and we want to reach a goal of only having you work 2,068 hours an hour a month. So that's what we mean by reduction in hours compared to our furlough, even though everybody, arbitrators and courts, their definitions are all over. So that's what we intended with the survey and what we meant. So then we get, what are we doing with furloughs? Again, a lot of you with administrative and clerical and your park and rec employees, because of non-critical employees, we already saw a fair number of you doing furloughs for both groups in 2020. In 2021, we don't see as many of you planning for that, but we all know that is likely going to be in a lot of your back pockets once we know financially and budget-wise, probably more so in late summer, we're probably going to see an uptick in those of you looking at furlough in 21. A lot of you had to do it in 20, not per se because of the budget, but because the governor shut down your facility and you couldn't have workers working. Therefore, out of operational necessity, not necessarily budget necessity, you're furloughed. So let's see where that goes. We think there'll be an uptick in that for 21, but we'll see. Then we get to those of you reducing hours, again, in a workday, work week, work year. We have a lot of you, again, similar to furloughs, though not a majority, reducing total work hours. A lot of you did the furloughs because you had to move quickly and you did it for continuous time. So we don't see as many reduction in hours, but we do think much more so than furloughs. That is, I know we worked with a lot of you scouring your contract language like we are for the seminar on looking at options to reduce hours. More so, you're looking at an annualized basis. If you work 2080, we're trying to reduce your pay by 10 hours, which results in X% across the board budget cut. So a lot more of you doing that, but we're doing this seminar to talk about, all right, what do you need to know? Quickly, it gets very cumbersome and confusing to provide furloughs or reducing hours, not on its face for FLSA exempt employees, that is your salaried employees, but as if you want to reduce, which obviously you do it generally because you want to reduce their salary, it gets very nuanced. So the presumption is you can't reduce pay of a salaried employee except for the exceptions we'll talk about. One, what can you just unilaterally do? One, you can do full work week absences. Again, put aside union contract language or negotiations. Because if they perform no work in a week, you don't have to pay them for that week. So that's salary savings. The other is a partial work week or partial workday absence, which you in the public sector can do, but it's only if it's a budget required furlough. And then during that work week, which usually shouldn't mean much, they've lost their salaried status. So basically, they have to be paid minimum wage and overtime, but usually that's not an issue with the wage you're paying them. So in the public sector, you can do budget required furloughs. On the other hand, prospectively to save money, you can do a salary reduction that's more fixed, more permanent, and more normal. So what you can't do though is bounce around from paying $1,000 in 1 week, $750 in the next, unless we're looking at the full work week or partial workday absences. So you can prospectively put aside union issues, do it on a fixed permanent basis. Now, a lot of you have sought, and you've done through notice or policy, voluntary reductions in your FLSA exempt employee, not only work, but primarily their pay. So on one hand, they can do that on a full day basis without much of an issue if it's truly voluntary and it's not attributed to sickness or disability. On the other hand, you can, in the public sector specifically, do partial day absences, like for 4 hours, you only work 4 hours on Tuesdays. So therefore, we're going to basically pro rata reduce your pay by 4 hours, but it's pretty nuanced. So first thing is you need a policy that says that per the federal regulations that we've cited below. And what it must say is that if an employee is gone for a partial day, you have the right to reduce their pay. So if you don't have a notice, which a lot of you are drafting now, or a policy that said that, which should be in your model policies, it's difficult for you to deduct a beyond a full work day or full work week voluntarily in FLSA exempt pay. But also, if someone, the third one is if someone's on a FMLA or the new emergency family medical leave, you can proportionally reduce their pay for time off. So that's voluntary reductions. So with that legal nuance, next survey is this. Are you reducing time worked and corresponding pay for FLSA exempt employees? And specifically, are you doing that now or project to do in 2020? And survey says, all right, so again, though we hear a lot of discussion, very little of you are doing that now, but again, something to look at for 2021, but as you can tell, it's legally cumbersome. So now we've talked law, let's talk about contract. You know, what are issues with that? So one is, again, a lot of this, we have quite a few grievance arbitration awards, so this all flows from that. What's good language? One is if you have any reference to hours, but remember, we're back to less is better. Do what you can to keep out any reference to what even a normal workday, work week, work hours are on an annual basis for employees. But if you have it, clarify, look at, we're only including hours for the sole purpose of, for example, determining what overtime pay should be. So if you limit it to that is why you have it in there, not that we're going to schedule people for that, not that we're going to have people work it. Arbitrators say, all right, that's good. That can give you a unilateral right and not violate the contract to reduce hours or furlough. In addition, the other golden language arbitrators have looked at is, do you have language that expressly says, even if you have the word normal in there, do you all on top of that say, that's no guarantee of any hours scheduled or work? So those are the two big things you should look for. If you have those, you're in good shape to furlough or reduce. If you don't, if you've got bad language, you might have to, and most likely have to meet, negotiate, and get union agreement, which I know, for example, we saw City of Duluth just did that with their AFSCME bargaining units, bargaining unit wide. So without looking at Duluth language, for example, we know likely their language may have been a trigger why they had to do it. And we'll talk about at the end that you should reach to the unions anyways. So what's bad? You shall schedule employees for certain hours, or you have voluminous references to hours and workday, work weeks, work cycles, or work year throughout your contract. Arbitrators will say, all right, that looks like you might have to schedule and work those people that. Or another big case that arose from the Great Recession, County of Pope, they had language that if an employee was reduced from 37 and a half hours, a goofy number, to less than that, their status was reduced from full-time to part-time. So an arbitrator in that case with this other language said, well, if you're reducing status through a furlough or reduction in hours, that is something that would violate the contract and requires union agreement. So these are three things. If you have these language, you're likely going to have to get union agreement. Then we talk about another options are subcontracting. We're basically a third party. What do we mean by that? Perform services or functions at a cheaper rate than it was otherwise performed by your employees or bargaining unit employees. And a lot of you are looking now on the city county level at joint powers agreements again, shared employees, one entity shares it with another, independent contractors, professional services. Then we get to hiring freeze, because all relates to number of people working as employees, that through attrition, if an employee leaves, you're simply not going to fill that spot. In lieu of hard layoffs, you're just saying we're not going to fill vacancies. So subcontracting, we're not seeing that in 20, not seeing much in 21. Hiring freezes, again, already in 2020, of course, primarily attributable to COVID. We still have, especially in admin and park and rec, a good chunk of you are already saying, look, if we lose a person, we're not filling it. And we're seeing that through other positions as well, library and generally public works. In 2021, for hiring freezes, we're seeing more of you doing that. So again, yes, much like the Great Recession, this is something you generally have management right to do. Generally, it saves costs. Generally, it causes less of a morale problem because you're not affirmatively laying off employees or telling them they're working less for less pay. But again, we understand we're talking about all the options, but this is one most used generally to save a lot by employers. So what's good language for subcontracting, especially if you're going to have any? Again, less is better. Generally not to address subcontracting. One, you should expressly say you have the right to do it. And two, just have a provision that says, look, we simply have to notify the union if we're going to subcontract. But what's bad language that a lot of you have? You either have minimum staffing or work crew numbers that, look, we always have to have 3 on certain shifts. That's bad language. That's going to hurt you here. Or you define the work expressly. Bargaining unit employees shall do snow plowing. Language like that, which you've seen, especially in Minnesota, that's bad. That's going to hamper your ability to subcontract or have non-bargaining unit employees do it. Or you have general language that says, by the way, we can't have non-union, non-bargaining unit employees assign or do certain work. Or another issue, which is often litigated, is if you have to specify the reason why you have to subcontract, for example. If you're nuanced on your reasons, that's going to make it more difficult. Now, we're going to talk about at the end through Chelsea how you can document those reasons, but that's where we get grievances in litigation, where we're debating whether or not you met the reason to subcontract or even in layoff world. So if you enumerate why you have to subcontract, generally that's bad, but that just means you got to meet that standard in the contract. So then we'll move to layoffs. Again, that's where you just separate an employee continuously from employment, or a lot of you are already utilizing voluntary separation incentives. So what are those who are not familiar? Basically what you do is you try to incentivize employees to leave employment, and then in the end, you're not going to fill their position so that you can get cost savings from not having a position filled. So what you do is you offer additional compensation on top of what they'd otherwise get for leaving, like through sick leave distribution, vacation leave payout, or health insurance contributions. You give them more than that in exchange for them, one, separating employment, and two is, as part of that, as part of an agreement where they agree and waive and release all claims against you. Now, generally for union employees, though I know we take nuanced ways to get there, in the end, the unions obviously have an argument that says if they're in the union, you're giving more compensation than the contract says they should get. And two is you're negotiating with a representative employee, you can't do that. So there are ways to not always have direct early negotiations with unions on this, but in the end, you're going to have to negotiate, and get union agreement on these incentives to avoid what's called impermissible direct dealing in the labor world. So layoffs, we're not seeing much in 2020, even with the COVID stuff. We are seeing a little more in 2021 projected, not just COVID-based, but financial and budget-based. Now, voluntary separation incentives, we're seeing much more of that than we are with layoffs. And again, we're seeing that across the board with all different employee groups. We're seeing that even through 2022. So especially related to layoffs, again, less is better, generally not best to address it except to say it's just our right to do it. But the more factors you enumerate other than seniority that you can consider layoffs, like employees' ability, performance, etc., the better off you are to make decisions on who you want to lay off. But a lot of you have the seniority only based layoff system. That means in a job class, within the unit, within the department, depending on your seniority provisions, the youngest has to go. So most of you have that, but again, most of you should try to give yourself discretion based on ability and performance. So let's maybe have contract language that says that. Now, as a general proposition, what's bad language? You've got minimum staffing you have to have. Again, once you lay somebody off, non-bargaining unit employee can't do the work. Seniority only layoffs, bumping rights, that is, if someone's laid off and they're more senior than somebody else, they can bump somebody. We all know that causes chaos, but I know we've all had to deal with it. But that's something definitely to negotiate potentially with unions if you've got real concerns about that, or if you got extended recall rights. That is, if you're laid off, most contracts will say you have a right to be recalled either within a job class, within a unit, department, etc. The more extended it is, the more uncertainty you have and the more it ties your hands if and when you're going to hire more people. So extended recall rights are generally not a good thing to have. So with that, we'll jump quickly to Chelsea to end it with, all right, what's the general process we recommend, especially in a unionized environment, to deal with all these issues if you intend to change?
All right, Brandon, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, and I apologize about that. My audio, both input and output, quit on me earlier. So moving on to process quickly, as Brandon mentioned, so there are certain cost-cutting measures that employers might want to consider or take, but that should be well documented why that cost-cutting measure, whatever it might be, is being taken in order to best position yourself in moving forward with that measure. So first step in the process is to draft a non-public analysis that sets out both the financial and operational business case along with potential options. So within that non-public analysis, it should set out both the business case and should take into consideration consequential costs. So including potential costs related to unemployment, insurance benefits, separation pay, backfill pay, and then also address impacted positions, employees, number of each employee's applicable labor contract provisions related to the actions and those that would be affected, and then finally go into a timeline. So you should have this analysis again to best position yourself to take any sort of measure, any of the measures that Brandon discussed. The second step in the process is recommended to get appropriate feedback, guidance and approval from managers, groups, and or governing bodies. So getting that feedback, but then also making sure that you document that feedback and are keeping notes related to the feedback that you do get. The third step in the generally recommended process is to consider submitting a notice to impacted employees and the unions about that intended action, and then also discuss it with employees and potentially the union before actually taking that action. And the reasons for doing that are to gauge potential challenges, which I'll address quickly in just a moment, to get support for that potential action, but then also to establish a record of good faith effort to communicate and get feedback on it, and determine whether to proceed with the final action or an alternative, or whether the process needs to change slightly depending on that discussion. And with that, whenever you are submitting a notice to particularly the unions, within that notice, it should specify in whether this is verbal or written communications. This language here is ideal, but that communications and discussions are not, nor that can they be construed to be an admission by the employer that it requires meeting, negotiating, agreement with the union before the employer can proceed with that action, that it's not a waiver of management right, And if that item is subject to negotiations, that the employer will negotiate as may be required. And finally, that the employer especially reserves and does waive its right to take any related action. So again, this language is preferred in submitting any notice to the union related to having discussions on that intended action. Steps 4 and 5. So 4 would be to notify employees of the action to be implemented after it is finalized. Again, based on feedback, there may be certain changes that need to be made, things that weren't thought of previously. And then 5 is to continue discussions with the unions if based on the action, if that has been requested by the union. And again, those discussions should incorporate that language that we had spelled out earlier. And then if deemed appropriate, again, this is going to depend on the process and the situation at hand, but at this point, there may be a memorandum of agreement that can be drafted to memorialize any resolution that's reached with the union, and that would be in order to avoid any grievance or legal challenge related to the intended action. Okay, and finally, general process, steps 6 and 7. So step 6, following, would be to address potential challenges from employees and or the union to the employer's actions. So potential challenges, Brandon mentioned some of this would be unfair labor practice or common law claims to state court based on the requirement that the employer was required to meet in good faith with the union and negotiate before changing or affecting terms and conditions of employment and or possibly a labor contract grievance. There's a note in here about the PERB board. So there is a board that was to start hearing unfair
It looks like Chelsea cut out, but this board was established 6 years ago, but it's never been fully functioning. And the PERB board is the board that would hear unfair labor practice claims. So it'd be analogous to the private sector, the National Labor Relations Board. So bottom line, what this would mean, and they already have a body of rules implemented because they're ready to go, but the legislature's never funded them and they might not. But if they are, at some point, this will make it a lot more administratively and financially easier for unions and or public employees to pursue unfair labor practice claims. Because right now, in the public sector, unlike the private sector, they're just almost non-existent. You know, we really literally only get a few of these a year for all the thousands of public employers we have. But if this PERB board is set up with all their nuanced rules, one, the volume of unfair labor practice claims are going to go up. Two, especially during a recession, there's going to be more of an uptick with this PERB board because of all these things we're talking about, how you may need to take serious measures to save money. And if the union doesn't agree and you implement it, we're probably going to see a lot more of these lack of, they call good faith meeting and negotiating PERB claims. And so full circle, though, it looks like the legislature might not fund them again, even though they're supposed to start up in a few weeks. And as you can tell, even from our end, we're not putting out alerts because we just still don't think they practically won't be able to function. Now, we're trying to gather intelligence. There's a special session. So as usual, we'll update you and the legislature acts on this at the last minute, as they often do with the PERB board. But it is going to be a real problem, more legally genuine concern for unfair labor practice claims if that board is functioning. So in addition to those legal claims, which are still rare, but maybe an uptick if there is PERB, also we saw a substantial body of arbitrable precedents established when unions bring grievances under the contract, when you try to, without their agreement, implement all these cost-cutting measures we're talking about. So one, we need to address those and be cognizant. 7, of course, then you implement the action. So with that, that concludes our our process part. Now we'll just open it up to any questions that folks may have via the chat button. So feel free to submit those. One question we did get that I don't think went to everybody was, is it prevalent for employers to, one, propose a general wage increase effective, let's say, January 1st, 21, and two is, but in exchange for that, free steps. Now, again, it's rare, but yeah, definitely something, an option you should consider. So by increasing everyone's base and doing it early, that results in some costs. But for a lot of you, these step increases range anywhere from the 2 to 4% range, and some of you more. So maybe in the totality, one, everybody reaps the benefits of an increase, and they also get compounding effects of increased specialty premium pay. But you're avoiding the cost of steps and their compounding impact. So again, rare, but the questioner was apt, Kelsey Clem from Detroit Lakes, I guess definitely something you should consider. So again, feel free to submit more questions, any other questions via chat. If not, we'll still take a few questions. Another one is, yes, we'll have the slides posted to our CGMC website afterwards. And here are the resources. Here's the link to the Coalition of Greater Minnesota City website. And again, we have other advice and tools, especially a lot of you looking at furloughs and layoffs. Another issue just brought up here in our last minute is, should we have non-unionized employees settle in on their wages before we negotiate a good agreement from the unions? Now, again, that's culturally specific. On one hand, that demonstrates the pattern. For example, we're going to give all non-union a 2% wage increase on 21. So good, it establishes the pattern, but as all of you I've had discussions with, the con is, if you haven't had a pattern especially, the unions will view that as the floor for negotiating. So I have to tell you, we can't give customized advice right now for everybody, but some for you to consider. But our concerns for a lot of you is that often sets the floor. And for a lot of you, it's really, let's get agreement from an essential unit who has power and culturally, legally and culturally, let's get them to agree first. And that'll set the tone for everybody, because unions may not view a non-union wage increase as reality. They may view it as a tactic, even though for some of you it sets the pattern, but for a lot of you, be careful doing that, make that an employer-specific decision. So back to where we're saying, we have notices that we'll try to update here for furloughs, layoffs, et cetera. So we do want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Definitely fill out the exit survey. We have no imminent webinars, but we'll probably be back at some point here with COVID. And we appreciate your attendance and all your feedback. And definitely use and abuse our website with advice and tools. So again, it looks like Chelsea's back. She can give the goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.